Welcome to Ship of the Week. This week's ship is the French express liner Ville de Havre. Before we begin, though, one quick note as an amendment to the previous episode, in which I referred to Winston Churchill's role as that of First Sea Lord, which is erroneous. He was instead First Lord of the Admiralty, the distinction being akin in the United States to the civilian Department of Defense and the various uniformed service chiefs of staff. The future will inevitably hold further errors, and absolutely feel free to point them out in the comments, and I'll add various notes where appropriate. Anyway, moving right along with Ville de Havre, born just a decade earlier, the French line was in 1865 looking to acquire additional ships to service the recently politically restabilized United States, and ordered from the Thames Iron Works in London a new liner of considerable size. Originally named for then French Emperor Napoleon III, the new liner entered service at 365 feet in length and displacing just under 4,000 tons. Napoleon III was a paddle steamer, carrying an auxiliary rig of sails on two masts with an average speed somewhere between 11 and 12 knots depending on conditions. Her maiden voyage was in April of 1866, and Napoleon III was not in service for all that long before she was withdrawn for an overhaul in 1870. Steamships had, several decades prior, begun the switch from paddles to screw propellers, such as Isambard Brunel's Great Britain seen here in 1844. The hydrodynamic properties of propellers and power plant advancements meant Napoleon III's systems were outdated years before their installation. Therefore, she would spend several years in refit before returning to service in 1873 with an additional mast, a new compound engine, and without the bulky paddle boxes that originally hung at her sides. She was lengthened, stretching some 50 feet longer than she did at her launch, and she increased in size by roughly 1,000 tons. Speed and fuel economy greatly improved. The ship also re-emerged with a new identity, owing to the final abolition of French imperialism and the restoration of a republican government. Napoleon was out, so the liner was renamed Ville de Havre after her home port. The reimagined Ville de Havre was also unfortunately far too short-lived. She began an eastbound crossing on the 15th of November 1873 with more than 300 passengers and crew aboard under Captain Marino Sermont. Meanwhile, the British clipper ship Loch Earn had departed England, heading in the opposite direction under William Robertson. In the early morning hours of November 22nd, the two ships sighted each other. Conventions of navigation dictated that Ville de Havre ought to yield to Loch Earn since the latter was exclusively under sail. This did not occur, and the much larger express liner maintained speed and heading as the distance between the two vessels rapidly shrank. The realization slowly dawning on the men aboard Loch Earn that the liner was not turning, they desperately tried swinging to starboard, but by then it was too little, too late. The two ships struck each other with such force that Ville de Havre nearly broke up immediately. Virtually launched from their bunks, the passengers and crew of both ships poured on deck. But it was clear neither ship was in good shape. The liner, however, was the immediate concern. Already considerably down by the head, great effort was exerted to free her lifeboats and get at least a few of them away, but the ship was coming apart beneath the feet of the panicked passengers, parts of her masts and rigging coming down atop the struggling crowd, and all semblance of an organized evacuation dissolved into chaos. All the while, Loch Earn stood by to receive as many as she could, but her forward bulkheads were barely managing to hold back the sea. 12 minutes after the collision, Ville de Havre slipped beneath the icy North Atlantic, taking 226 passengers and crew with her. Captain Robertson and his crew managed to pluck 87 survivors from the ocean, combing the area until long after daybreak for any sign of life. Finding none, they turned their attention to their own ship, which too was slowly dying. A cargo ship from the United States had arrived in the vicinity that morning and was able to take on most of the people aboard Loch Earn, while a skeleton crew attempted to get her safely to Ireland before the sea forced them to abandon ship. They were picked up sometime later. One story in particular is rather difficult, that of Horatio Spafford and his wife and 4 daughters, who all intended to sail to France together but were separated by various business affairs Mr. Spafford needed to address in Chicago, so his family departed ahead of him. The 4 girls were lost, and Mrs. Spafford was found barely hanging on. It is unsurprising that upon receiving one of the worst telegrams one can imagine, Mr. Spafford rushed to Wales, where the liner's survivors were taken as quickly as he could. Ville de Havre remains one of the deadliest shipwrecks in French history.